In the fall of 2001, as American Special Forces prepared to invade Afghanistan, a British diplomat handed them a book. It was a collection of warnings, cautionary tales, historical precedents that all said the same thing: don't do this. The book documented how the British Empire, at the height of its global power, had invaded Afghanistan 3 times and lost 3 times. How the Soviet Union, one of history's most formidable military machines, had poured 115,000 troops into Afghanistan for a decade and lost. How Alexander the Great himself had struggled in these mountains. How the Mongols had bled here. How every empire that ever thought it could conquer Afghanistan discovered the same terrible truth: you can invade Afghanistan, but you cannot hold it. The American commanders accepted the book politely, and then they did exactly what history warned them not to do. 20 years later, after 2,400 American deaths, $2 trillion spent, and the longest war in American history, U.S. helicopters evacuated the last personnel from Kabul as the Taliban, the very enemy they'd overthrown in 2001, marched back into power. It was August 2021, and Afghanistan had claimed another empire. This is the story of why America ignored every warning, repeated every mistake, and learned every lesson the hard way. This is the story of how the world's most powerful military became the latest victim of the graveyard of empires. To understand why America failed in Afghanistan, we need to understand the pattern. Because Afghanistan doesn't defeat empires through superior firepower or brilliant strategy. It defeats them through geography, culture, and time. Afghanistan is a fortress built by nature itself. The Hindu Kush Mountains dominate the landscape, peaks reaching over 24,000 feet, valleys so deep that winter's sun never reaches the bottom, passes so narrow that a handful of defenders can hold off an army. The country is roughly the size of Texas, but with terrain that makes conventional military operations nearly impossible. There are no major highways connecting the country, no infrastructure that an invading force can seize and use to control the population. Instead, there are thousands of isolated valleys, each essentially autonomous, each following its own tribal codes that predate any modern government by centuries. This is the first thing every empire learns too late. Afghanistan isn't really one country. It's dozens of micro-kingdoms held together by the loosest possible threads of national identity. The population is a patchwork of ethnic groups: Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and more. Each with their own languages, histories, and grievances. The only thing they traditionally agree on is resisting foreign occupation, and they're very, very good at it. The second thing empires learn is that Afghans don't fight the way modern militaries expect. There are no pitched battles, no decisive engagements where superior firepower guarantees victory. Instead, there's guerrilla warfare perfected over centuries of practice. Ambushes in mountain passes, attacks on supply convoys, sudden raids followed by melting back into the civilian population. The enemy you're fighting today might be the village elder you're negotiating with tomorrow. The young man selling you vegetables might plant an IED tonight. The local police force you're training might defect to the Taliban next week. It's warfare designed to frustrate, exhaust, and outlast any occupier. Because Afghans have one weapon that no invading army can match: time. They can wait. They can endure. They can lose every battle and still win the war. Because eventually, every foreign army goes home. This is the pattern. And by 2001, it had repeated so many times that it should have been impossible to ignore. Let's Let's start with the British, because their experience in Afghanistan reads like a blueprint for exactly what not to do. A blueprint America would later follow almost perfectly. In 1839, the British Empire was at its zenith. Queen Victoria ruled over territories spanning a quarter of the globe. The British Army was the most professional fighting force in the world. And British strategists were worried about Afghanistan, not because Afghanistan threatened them directly, but because of what they called the Great Game, the geopolitical contest between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia for influence in Central Asia. If Russia gained control of Afghanistan, British strategists believed they could threaten Britain's crown jewel, India. So in 1839, British forces invaded Afghanistan to install a puppet king, Shah Shuja, who would be loyal to British interests. The initial invasion was easy, almost too easy. British forces marched to Kabul, overthrew the existing ruler, and installed their chosen monarch with minimal resistance. British officers settled into comfortable compounds in Kabul. They brought their families. They held polo matches and dinner parties. They convinced themselves that Afghanistan was pacified. For 2 years, it seemed to work. And then, in November 1841, the Afghans rose up. What started as isolated attacks became a general uprising. The British garrison in Kabul found itself besieged. Supply lines were cut. Outposts fell one by one. The British commander negotiated a withdrawal. The Afghans promised safe passage back to India for the entire British garrison. 4,500 troops plus 12,000 camp followers, including women and children. On January 6, 1842, the column left Kabul and headed for the Khyber Pass. They never made it. What followed was one of the most catastrophic military disasters in British history. Afghan warriors attacked the column in the mountain passes. Blizzards and sub-zero temperatures killed those who survived the ambushes. Of the 16,500 people who left Kabul, exactly one made it to the British fort at Jalalabad. One. Dr. William Bryden, a military surgeon, rode into Jalalabad on an exhausted horse, barely alive, to tell the story of the massacre. The entire British force had been annihilated. You'd think that would be enough to teach the lesson. It wasn't. The British invaded again in 1878. This time, they had better planning, better logistics, better intelligence. They occupied Afghanistan for 2 years, and then they left, having achieved nothing permanent except more casualties and more expense. They tried once more in 1919. The Third Anglo-Afghan War lasted less than 3 months before Britain essentially gave up and recognized Afghan independence. 3 invasions, 3 failures. The lesson seemed clear. Afghanistan could not be conquered and held by a foreign power. But if the British experience wasn't warning enough, the Soviet Union was about to provide an even more recent and relevant example. December 24th, 1979, Christmas Eve in the West. In Afghanistan, Soviet transport planes began landing at Kabul airport in the darkness. The Soviet Union was about to make the same mistake the British had made 140 years earlier. But this time, the whole world would watch. The Soviets had what seemed like valid reasons to intervene. Afghanistan's communist government, installed in a 1978 coup, was struggling. Rural populations were revolting against forced modernization and anti-religious policies. The government was fracturing, with communist factions killing each other. Soviet leaders worried about instability on their southern border. They worried about Islamic fundamentalism spreading to Soviet Central Asia. They worried about American influence filling any power vacuum, so they invaded. And like the British before them, The initial operation went smoothly. Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace and killed the Afghan president. 115,000 Soviet troops poured into the country. Major cities were secured. The Soviets installed a more pliable leader and prepared for a short, successful intervention. They expected to be home within months. They stayed for 9 years. The Soviets had every advantage a modern military could want: helicopter gunships, heavy armor, total air superiority, satellite intelligence, a professional army with combat experience. And none of it mattered. The Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, didn't fight the Soviets where Soviet strengths could be brought to bear. They fought from the mountains, from the villages, from the shadows. A Soviet convoy would roll through a valley, secure it, and move on. The moment they left, the Mujahideen would return. The Soviets controlled the roads during the day. The Mujahideen controlled everything else at night. Soviet forces adopted increasingly brutal tactics. If a village supported the Mujahideen, the village was destroyed. Entire valleys were depopulated. Millions of Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran as refugees. The Soviets dropped butterfly mines, small explosive devices designed to look like toys, that killed and maimed Afghan children. They bombed irrigation systems. They destroyed crops. They tried to create a wasteland that couldn't support resistance. It didn't work because what the Soviets didn't understand, what the British hadn't understood, is that you can't terrorize Afghans into submission. Violence just creates more resistance. Every civilian killed becomes a martyr. Every destroyed village creates a new generation of fighters. And the Mujahideen had something the Soviets couldn't match: foreign support. The United States, through the CIA, poured billions of dollars into supporting the Afghan resistance. Pakistan's intelligence service trained and equipped the Mujahideen. Saudi Arabia provided funding and fighters. American-made Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons transformed the conflict. Suddenly, Soviet helicopters and aircraft were vulnerable. Soviet air superiority, their key advantage, was neutralized. The war became a meat grinder. Soviet casualties mounted. 15,000 dead, 35,000 wounded. Morale collapsed. The Soviet public turned against the war. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew. The communist government they left behind collapsed within 3 years. The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan had achieved nothing except death and destruction. It had weakened the Soviet Union economically and politically. Many historians argue it accelerated the Soviet collapse. And it had provided a perfect, recent case study in exactly why invading Afghanistan was a terrible idea. The lessons were right there, crystal clear, documented, studied in military academies around the world. And then, 12 years later, it was America's turn to ignore them all. September 11, 2001 changed everything. When the Twin Towers fell, when the Pentagon burned, when United Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania, the American public demanded action. Not just action, vengeance. And the trail led to Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, the architect of the 9/11 attacks, was in Afghanistan. His al-Qaeda network operated training camps there, protected by the Taliban government that controlled most of the country. The Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic movement that had emerged from Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan, had seized power in 1996. They ruled through a strict interpretation of Islamic law, banned education for girls, destroyed cultural heritage, and harbored terrorists. President George W. Bush delivered an ultimatum: hand over bin Laden and dismantle al-Qaeda, or face invasion. The Taliban refused. On October 7, 2001, American aircraft began bombing Afghanistan. Special forces teams working with CIA operatives in the Northern Alliance, Afghan groups that opposed the Taliban, coordinated airstrikes and ground operations. The campaign was devastatingly effective. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. Major cities fell. Taliban forces melted away into the mountains and across the border into Pakistan. By December, the United States had achieved its initial objective. The Taliban government was gone. Al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed, and Afghanistan had a new internationally recognized government. It looked like a textbook victory. Fast, efficient, achieved with minimal American casualties. Military analysts marveled at how Special Operations Forces and precision air power had toppled a government in weeks. This is where America should have declared victory and left. This is where the warnings from history became absolutely critical. Because what came next was the classic mistake. The decision to stay, to rebuild, to create a stable democratic Afghanistan aligned with Western values. The Bush administration decided that simply defeating the Taliban wasn't enough. They would transform Afghanistan into a modern democracy. They would build infrastructure, create a functioning government, establish women's rights, and prove that nation building could work in the 21st century. It was mission creep on a civilizational scale, and it ignored every single lesson from British and Soviet failures. Here's what those lessons should have taught American planners. 1. Military victory doesn't equal political victory. You can defeat Afghan forces on the battlefield, but you can't force Afghans to accept a foreign-imposed government. 2. Afghanistan resists modernization imposed from outside. Social change has to come from within Afghan society at Afghan pace, or it won't stick. 3. Time is on the side of the resistance. Foreign armies eventually leave. Local forces never do. 4. You can't bomb an insurgency into submission. Violence creates more insurgents. 5. Afghanistan's geography makes permanent occupation nearly impossible. You'd need hundreds of thousands of troops to control the countryside, and even then, you'd only control where your troops physically stand. American planners knew all this. The warnings were explicit. Books, reports, and briefings detailed exactly what had gone wrong for the British and Soviets. But there was something different this time. American leaders believed. Something that would make Afghanistan different for America than it had been for everyone else. First, they believed American technology and precision warfare made them fundamentally different from previous invaders. Drones, satellite surveillance, night vision equipment, precision-guided munitions. The U.S. military could do things the British and Soviets could never dream of. Second, they believed their intentions were pure. They weren't conquering Afghanistan for imperial gain. They were liberating it from the Taliban, bringing democracy and human rights, helping Afghans build a better future. Third, they believed in American exceptionalism, the idea that American values, American systems, American methods would work where others had failed, because America was different, better, more enlightened. This combination of technological superiority, moral certainty, and national exceptionalism created a dangerous blindness to historical patterns. And so, instead of learning from history, America repeated it. The first few years after the invasion looked promising, almost hopeful. Hamid Karzai, an Afghan from a prominent Pashtun family, became the transitional leader. In 2004, he won the country's first democratic presidential election. A new constitution was drafted, girls returned to school. Kabul began to rebuild. Billions of dollars in international aid poured into the country. New roads were constructed. Clinics opened. Universities admitted students. For the first time in decades, young Afghans could imagine a future that wasn't dominated by war. But beneath the surface, The same patterns from British and Soviet occupations were already emerging. The Taliban hadn't been destroyed. They'd retreated. To the mountains, to remote villages, across the border into Pakistan's tribal areas, where Pakistani intelligence had protected them for years. And they waited, because that's what Afghans do. They wait for the foreigners to make mistakes. The Americans made plenty. First mistake? Ignoring the countryside. The US and NATO focused resources on Kabul and major cities. Rural Afghanistan, where most Afghans actually lived, was largely neglected. The new Afghan government had no real presence in rural areas. The police were corrupt. The courts didn't function. Local warlords filled the power vacuum, often behaving as badly as the Taliban had. For a rural Afghan, the new democratic government meant nothing except corruption and foreign troops occasionally raiding villages looking for Taliban. Second mistake, alienating the population through military operations. U.S. forces, despite their technological advantages, couldn't tell who was Taliban and who was a civilian. So they conducted night raids on compounds based on intelligence that was often wrong. Imagine, you're an Afghan farmer. American soldiers break into your home at 3 a.m., terrify your family, search your house, maybe detain you for questioning. Later, they apologize. Wrong house, bad intelligence. But your neighbors saw foreign troops invade your home. Your children are traumatized. Your dignity is shattered. Are you more likely to support the foreign-backed government after that? Or the Taliban who promised to drive the foreigners out? Third mistake, the corruption. American money flooded Afghanistan faster than any accountability systems could handle. Afghan officials stole massive amounts. Contractors inflated costs. Warlords pocketed reconstruction funds. The Karzai government became synonymous with corruption. Legitimacy, the one thing the government needed to survive, eroded with every scandal, every stolen dollar, every unpunished crime. Fourth mistake, Pakistan. The United States needed Pakistan's cooperation. Supply routes ran through Pakistan. Intelligence was shared with Pakistan. But Pakistani intelligence, ISI, was simultaneously supporting the Taliban as a strategic asset against India. So America was trying to defeat an enemy that its own ally was protecting and funding. It was an impossible contradiction. That American strategy never resolved. By 2005, Taliban attacks were increasing. By 2006, they controlled significant territory. By 2008, it was clear the Taliban were coming back. The American response was predictable. Send more troops. In 2009, President Obama authorized a surge. Troop levels to 100,000, nearly matching Soviet numbers at their peak. The goal was to stabilize Afghanistan long enough to train Afghan security forces to take over. The surge reduced Taliban control in some areas, but it didn't change the fundamental dynamics. The Taliban still retreated to Pakistan when pressured. They still returned when U.S. forces moved on. They still had time on their side. And American commanders kept making the same observations the British had made in 1842 and the Soviets had made in 1985. We control the cities during the day, but lose the countryside at night. We can't tell friend from foe. We're training security forces that lack motivation and loyalty. Corruption is undermining everything. It was the same war, the same patterns, the same frustrations. The only question was how long it would take American leaders to admit it. By 2011, the Obama administration was looking for an exit. The death of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan that May seemed like the perfect opportunity to declare victory and leave. The original mission, punish al-Qaeda for 9/11s, was accomplished, but America couldn't just leave. The Afghan government would collapse. The Taliban would return. everything built over 10 years would crumble. So instead of leaving, the U.S. shifted to a new strategy: transition. Train Afghan security forces, transfer responsibility to them, reduce American presence gradually. It was the same strategy the Soviets had tried in the late 1980s. It hadn't worked for them either. The Afghan National Army looked impressive on paper. 350,000 soldiers and police. Billions spent on training and equipment, American advisors embedded at every level. But the numbers were deceptive. Ghost soldiers, names on the roster that drew salaries but didn't exist, inflated the real strength. Desertion rates were astronomical. Literacy rates were so low that many soldiers couldn't read their weapons manuals. More critically, motivation was lacking. Afghan soldiers were fighting for a government many didn't believe in, commanded by officers they didn't respect, for pay that often didn't arrive. The Taliban, meanwhile, were fighting for ideology, for their vision of Afghanistan, and they could wait forever. Every indicator pointed toward the same conclusion. When Americans left, the Afghan government would fall. The only question was, how quickly? But admitting that meant admitting that 20 years, 2,400 American lives, tens of thousands of Afghan lives, and $2 trillion had achieved nothing permanent. So the war continued, year after year. Under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, each administration inherited the same impossible choice: stay and bleed slowly, or leave and watch everything collapse. Trump negotiated a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban in 2020, cutting the Afghan government out of the talks entirely. It set a May 2021 deadline for complete U.S. withdrawal. Biden inherited that agreement and extended the deadline to September 11, 2021, the 20th anniversary of the attacks that had started everything. The withdrawal was chaotic and tragic. As American forces left, the Afghan military, the one America had spent 20 years building, collapsed in days. Taliban fighters swept through provinces, often without firing a shot. Afghan soldiers abandoned their posts. Local officials negotiated surrenders. Warlords switched sides. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country with as much money as he could carry. The Republic of Afghanistan ceased to exist. At Kabul airport, desperate Afghans tried to board American evacuation flights. Some clung to the outside of aircraft and fell to their deaths after takeoff. A suicide bombing killed 13 American service members and 170 Afghans. The last American soldier left Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021. 20 years. $2 trillion. 2,400 American dead. Over 100,000 Afghan civilians killed. And the Taliban were back in power, stronger than when the war started. Afghanistan had claimed another empire. So why did America ignore every warning? Why did the world's most powerful military, with access to perfect historical examples of what not to do, repeat the exact same mistakes? The answer is uncomfortable, because empires always believe they're different. The British believed their imperial experience and military professionalism made them superior to previous invaders. It didn't matter. The Soviets believed their communist ideology and modern military technology made them different from the British. It didn't matter. The Americans believed their precision weapons, their good intentions, and their democratic values made them different from everyone who'd come before. It didn't matter. Afghanistan doesn't care about your technology or your intentions or your ideology. It just waits for you to learn the same lessons everyone else learned. There's also the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've invested blood and treasure, Leaving feels like admitting it was all for nothing. So you invest more, hoping to finally achieve victory that justifies the cost. But in Afghanistan, that logic leads to decade after decade of reinforcing failure. There's the domestic political cost of admitting defeat. No American president wanted to be the one who lost Afghanistan. So each one passed the problem to the next, kicking the can down the road rather than accepting the inevitable. There's the fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of conflict this was. America treated Afghanistan as a military problem that could be solved with enough force and resources. But it was never a military problem. It was a political, cultural, and social problem. You can't bomb your way to a stable democracy. You can't force cultural change at gunpoint. And you can't create national unity in a country that's never had it. The British learned this. The Soviets learned this. Now America has learned it too. But the lesson never seems to stick. Because for the next empire that looks at Afghanistan and thinks, yes, but we'll do it differently, the pattern is already waiting to repeat. Let's talk about what 20 years in Afghanistan actually cost. 2,400 American service members dead, 20,000 wounded, many more dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and the invisible scars of war. Over 100,000 Afghan civilians killed, millions displaced, an entire generation that grew up knowing nothing but war. $2 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's about $300 million per day, every day, for 20 years. It's more than the GDP of most countries. What did that money buy? In Afghanistan, a corrupt government that collapsed in days, an army that dissolved without fighting, infrastructure that couldn't be maintained, schools that might close again, rights for women that are already being rolled back. In America, less investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, resources diverted from actual threats, a generation of veterans carrying physical and psychological wounds. But perhaps the greatest cost is strategic. The Afghanistan war distracted from emerging threats. It consumed resources and attention while China rose economically and militarily. It demonstrated American limitations rather than American strength. And it taught a lesson to adversaries. If you can be patient enough, if you can outlast American attention spans and political cycles, you can defeat the world's most powerful military without ever matching its strength. The Taliban proved this. They lost every battle and won the war by simply surviving until America left. That's a lesson that other adversaries, from Iran to North Korea to regional insurgencies everywhere, are certainly studying. The tragedy of Afghanistan is that it was always going to end this way. The historical pattern was clear. The warnings were explicit. The lessons were there to learn. But empires don't learn from history. They repeat it, convinced that this time will be different. Afghanistan earned its reputation as the graveyard of empires, not through military genius or technological sophistication. It earned it through patience, through terrain, through a cultural resistance to foreign rule that outlasts any invading force. The British learned this lesson 3 times and still didn't internalize it. The Soviets learned it, and their empire collapsed, partly as a result. Now America has paid $2 trillion and 2,400 lives to learn the same lesson. The question is, will the next empire that looks at Afghanistan be any wiser? History suggests the answer is no. Because the pattern isn't about who invades Afghanistan. It's about Afghanistan itself, a land that has been resisting empires for thousands of years and will continue resisting them long after today's superpowers are footnotes in history books. The empires change, the mountains remain, and the graveyard grows. If this deep dive into one of history's most repeated mistakes opened your eyes to how empires fail, make sure to subscribe to Imperial Echoes. We bring you the forgotten wars, the misunderstood conflicts, and the lessons that every generation seems to learn too late. One cinematic documentary at a time. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which historical conflict you want us to analyze next, and check out our other videos on military history's greatest blunders and unexpected victories. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and we're here to help you hear the echoes. Let's learn from the past before we become its next victim.